They called her the burdensome bride of Oakhaven. When Elias Montgomery married a woman twice the size of the local belles, the whispers predicted ruin. He thought her weight meant laziness. He thought she couldn't even boil water. He was dead wrong, and her cast-iron skillet was about to change history. The Dakota Territory, in the summer of 1884, was no place for the soft or the slow, and by all outward appearances, Martha Caldwell was both. When Elias Montgomery brought her to the Whispering Pines Ranch as his newlywed wife, the local gossips of Redwater Creek sharpened their claws. Elias was a hardened man, lean as a whip snake and weathered by years of drought, cattle rustlers, and relentless prairie winds. He was a man who measured worth in calluses and sweat. Martha, on the other hand, was a woman of substantial girth. She was soft-spoken, heavy-set, and possessed a quiet demeanor that Elias misread entirely as a lack of constitution. Their marriage was not born of sweeping romance. It was a desperate transaction. The ranch was drowning in debt. The local bank, managed by a ruthless opportunist named Harrison Cobb, was 30 days away from foreclosing on the Montgomery land. Martha's father, a prosperous mercantile owner back in Missouri, had offered Elias a dowry just large enough to keep the bank at bay for one more season. In exchange, Elias was to take Martha off her father's hands, a cruel arrangement born from her family's embarrassment over her size in a society that prized frail, corseted waists. Elias had agreed, swallowing his pride to save his family's legacy. But resentment is a bitter seed, and it took root quickly in the dry Dakota soil. From the moment Martha stepped off the stagecoach, out of breath and perspiring in the relentless July sun, Elias made his assumptions. He looked at her broad hips and thick arms and saw only a liability. He assumed her size was the result of lifelong gluttony and indolence. He gave her the master bedroom in the drafty ranch house, moved his own belongings into the small study down the hall, and spoke to her only when necessary. "The ranch hands eat at the mess hall," Elias told her on her second day, his tone clipped. "We have a camp cook, an old-timer named Beans O'Malley. You needn't worry yourself with the kitchen, Martha. Just try to keep out of the heat. I don't have the time to fetch the doctor if you faint." Martha had stood on the porch, her hands resting on her generous waist, watching Elias ride off toward the lower pastures. The dismissal stung, a familiar ache in her chest. All her life, people had looked at her heavy frame and decided they knew everything about her character, her intelligence, and her worth. She wasn't lazy. She was, in fact, a woman of deep, methodical stamina, and while Elias thought her hands were soft, he hadn't noticed the faint, silvery burn scars on her forearms, the marks of a woman who had spent 15 years mastering the alchemy of open-flame cooking under the tutelage of her grandmother. For the first 2 months, Martha lived like a ghost in her own home. She watched the ranch fall further into disrepair. The morale of the ranch hands was abysmal. Elias was pushing them to the brink, trying to fatten up a herd of 500 longhorns for a lucrative contract with the Union Pacific Railroad. If they secured the contract, the Whispering Pines would be saved. If they failed, a wealthy, predatory cattle baron named Thaddeus Beaumont was waiting to buy the land for pennies on the dollar. Thaddeus Beaumont was a man who fought dirty. He had already begun poaching Elias's men, offering higher wages and whiskey. But the real reason Elias's men were threatening to leave was the food. Beans O'Malley was a spectacular failure of a cook. He served the exhausted men gray, unseasoned slabs of boiled beef, biscuits that could shatter a molar, and coffee that tasted of river mud and rust. The men were starving, exhausted, and losing the muscle mass required to wrangle half-wild cattle. Elias, consumed by his stress over the bank and the looming arrival of the railroad inspector, Nathaniel Price, ignored the grumbling of his crew. "They're paid to rope, not to dine," Elias snapped one evening when his foreman, a grizzled man named Wyatt Reed, complained about the slop. Martha heard it all from the hallway. That night, she didn't weep over her husband's coldness. Instead, she walked down to the cellar, carrying a kerosene lamp, and began taking inventory. She found barrels of salted pork, sacks of flour, wild prairie onions, dried red chilies, and a neglected patch of wild sage and thyme growing stubbornly near the creek. She touched the dusty, cold iron of the massive wood stove in the main kitchen, a stove that hadn't been fired up since Elias's mother died. Martha closed her eyes. She knew the language of cast iron, smoke, and fat. She knew how to save a man's soul with a hot meal. She was just waiting for her moment. It came with a crash, a fire, and a twist of pure betrayal. It was 4 days before the Union Pacific inspector was scheduled to arrive. The ranch was entering the most critical phase of the season, the final branding and sorting of the beef cattle. Elias had hired 10 extra temporary hands to help with the brutal, grueling work. But Thaddeus Beaumont struck first. Under the cover of night, Beaumont sent 2 of his lackeys to the Whispering Pines camp with 3 jugs of cheap rye whiskey. They found Beans O'Malley, whose loyalty was as thin as his gravy. By midnight, O'Malley was blind drunk. By 2 a.m., he had knocked over a lantern in the smokehouse, setting a fire that destroyed half their cured meat supply. By dawn, O'Malley was gone, having fled across the county line with a pouch of Beaumont's silver. Elias stood in the smoky ruins of the outbuilding, his face pale beneath a layer of soot. Wyatt Reed stood beside him, his expression grim. "We got 25 men arriving at the pens in an hour, boss," Wyatt said, his voice low. "We got no cook. We got half our meat gone. Men can't wrestle yearlings for 14 hours on empty bellies. They'll walk. And if they walk, Beaumont gets the herd. It's over." Elias rubbed his temples, desperation clawing at his throat. "Saddle my horse. I'll ride into Dry Gulch, see if I can hire the cook from the saloon." Beaumont already bought him out, a soft, steady voice interrupted. Elias and Wyatt turned. Martha stood on the porch, wrapped in a heavy cotton apron that stretched across her wide hips. Her hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and her sleeves were rolled up past her elbows, revealing thick, capable forearms. "What are you doing out here, Martha?" Elias asked, his tone snapping with misplaced frustration. "Go back inside. I don't have time to manage you today." "You don't have to manage me, Elias," Martha said, her voice carrying a steely resonance he had never heard before. "And you don't have to ride into town. I'll feed the men." Wyatt shifted uncomfortably, staring at the dirt. Elias let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Martha, be reasonable," Elias said, marching up the porch steps. He looked at her imposing figure, his eyes flashing with a mix of pity and annoyance. "Cooking for 25 men out on the branding range isn't baking a pie for a church social. It's lifting 50-pound sacks of flour. It's working over an open fire in 90-degree heat. You can barely walk up to the hayloft without losing your breath. You'll collapse by noon." Martha didn't flinch. She looked her husband dead in the eye, the years of silent endurance hardening into something unbreakable. "You married me for my father's money, Elias Montgomery," she said softly, so Wyatt couldn't hear. "You took my dignity to save your ranch. The least you can do is let me save your pride. Have Wyatt bring the chuck wagon around to the main kitchen. I need 2 strong boys to load my supplies. The men will eat at noon." Before Elias could argue, she turned her broad back to him and walked into the house. The heat inside the kitchen was soon infernal. Martha moved with a surprising fluid grace. Her size, which Elias viewed as a hindrance, was the anchor of her strength. She didn't flutter. She planted herself. She hauled cast-iron Dutch ovens that weighed 30 pounds each as if they were tin cups. She didn't try to make fancy, delicate food. She made survival food, elevated by the secrets of her Louisiana-born grandmother. She took the tough, stringy cuts of beef that O'Malley had left behind, seared them fiercely in rendered pork fat until they bore a dark, caramelized crust, and then drowned them in a dark, rich gravy made from beef bone broth, black pepper, wild onions, and a splash of Elias's secret stash of bourbon. She let the meat braise slow and deep. She mixed giant wooden bowls of buttermilk biscuit dough, her thick fingers deftly cutting cold lard into the flour until it resembled coarse sand, the secret to a flakiness that melts on the tongue. She stewed pinto beans with molasses, smoked bacon ends, and dried red chilies that bled a fiery, beautiful red into the pot. By 11:30 a.m., the smell drifting from the ranch house was doing strange things to the men down at the branding pens. The work had been brutal. The sun was merciless. Beaumont had even paid some drifters to fire gunshots near the ridge, trying to spook the herd and injure the men. The cowboys were bruised, battered, and on the verge of mutiny. "I'm done," a young ranch hand named Caleb spat, throwing his lasso into the dirt. "I ain't dying for a man who can't even feed me a decent plate of beans." "Hold on, boy," Wyatt said, though he looked ready to drop himself. He sniffed the air. A sudden, intoxicating breeze swept down from the main house. It smelled of wood smoke, roasted garlic, sweet molasses, and peppery beef. The chuck wagon rolled down the hill, driven by a wide-eyed stable boy. Beside him sat Martha Caldwell Montgomery. Elias watched from the fence, his jaw tight. He expected a disaster. He expected his men to mock her. He expected her to weep. Martha stepped down from the wagon. She didn't look at Elias. She grabbed a massive iron ladle, slammed it against the side of the Dutch oven like a dinner bell, and yelled, "Line up! You don't eat till you wash your hands in the trough." The men, hypnotized by the aroma, obeyed without question. Wyatt was the first. Martha heaped 2 massive steaming biscuits onto his tin plate, smothered them in the dark, shining bourbon beef gravy, and added a heaping ladle of the spicy, bacon-laced beans. Wyatt took his plate to the shade of an oak tree. He took one bite. Elias watched his foreman carefully. Wyatt stopped chewing. He stared at his plate. Then, without a word, Wyatt began to eat with a ferocious, desperate speed, tears actually welling in the corners of his dust-caked eyes. One by one, the men took their first bites. A stunning, reverent silence fell over the chaotic branding camp. The only sounds were the scraping of tin forks and the lowing of the cattle. The food wasn't just good, it was a revelation. It was heat, comfort, and undeniable power. It was food that told a working man he was valued. Elias walked over to the wagon. Martha didn't look up as she handed him a plate. Elias looked at the heavy, dark gravy clinging to the flaky biscuits. He took his fork, broke off a piece of the beef which yielded instantly, meltingly tender, and put it in his mouth. The explosion of flavor, the sharp bite of black pepper, the deep, savory richness of the beef fat, the slight, sweet tang of the bourbon and onions shook Elias to his core. He looked up at Martha. She was wiping sweat from her brow with her apron, her face flushed, her breathing heavy but steady. She wasn't frail. She was a titan. "Martha," Elias whispered, the first crack appearing in his hardened exterior. "Eat, Mr. Montgomery," she interrupted coldly, not meeting his gaze. "You have cattle to brand, and I have dinner to start." That afternoon, a miraculous shift occurred. Fueled by the dense, restorative calories of Martha's cooking, the men worked like demons. When Beaumont's drifters tried to spook the herd a second time, Wyatt and the boys didn't just chase them off. They rode them down, disarmed them, and sent them running back to Beaumont with bloody noses. The morale had shifted from despair to violent, unyielding loyalty. But the true test was yet to come. Nathaniel Price, the railroad inspector, was arriving in 2 days, and Thaddeus Beaumont, enraged by the failure of his sabotage, was preparing to play his final, most devastating card. Elias had realized his wife's worth in the kitchen, but he was about to find out that her mind was as sharp as her cast-iron skillet. The Whispering Pines Ranch transformed over the next 48 hours. The men, bellies full of Martha's braised beef, buttermilk biscuits, and spiced apple cobblers, worked with a manic, joyous intensity. The cattle were branded, sorted, and pushed into the holding pens with record speed. But Thaddeus Beaumont was not a man who surrendered to a frying pan. Beaumont was wealthy, ruthless, and heavily connected to the Chicago meatpacking magnates. He frequently boasted of his personal correspondence with Philip Danforth Armour, the legendary Meat King, using the name to intimidate local ranchers. When Beaumont learned that Elias's men hadn't abandoned him, he decided to cut the head off the snake. If Nathaniel Price, the Union Pacific inspector, never saw Elias's herd, the bank would foreclose, and Beaumont would win. The morning Price was due to arrive. Elias awoke to Wyatt, pounding frantically on the front door. "Boss, you better get out here," Wyatt hollered, his voice tight with panic. Elias threw on his boots and sprinted to the porch. Down at the main valley, past the only stagecoach road leading into Whispering Pines, a barricade of felled pine trees blocked the path. Standing in front of it was Beaumont, flanked by 6 armed hired guns, and Harrison Cobb, the corrupt local banker. Elias saddled his horse and rode down, his hand hovering near his Winchester rifle. Martha, wiping flour from her hands, watched from the kitchen window, her heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "What is the meaning of this, Beaumont?" Elias demanded as he pulled his stallion up short, dust swirling around the barricade. Beaumont, sitting atop a magnificent gray gelding, smiled a thin, oily smile. "Quarantine, Montgomery. I received a wire from the territorial governor's office this morning. Reports of Texas fever in the southern counties. Since your herd came up the trail late, sheriff's orders are to isolate your stock. No one goes in or out." "That's a damn lie," Elias roared. "My herd is clean, and you know it. You bought off the sheriff." Harrison Cobb stepped forward, pulling a gold watch from his vest. "Be that as it may, Elias, the law is the law. Mr. Price's stagecoach will be arriving at the crossroads in an hour. We've already sent a rider to intercept him and bring him to Beaumont's estate. Your cattle cannot be inspected, and since your note is due at sunset tomorrow, I'm afraid Whispering Pines belongs to the bank." Elias felt the blood drain from his face. The sky seemed to tilt. He had worked his fingers to the bone. He had nearly broken his men. And just when his wife had single-handedly resurrected their morale, it was being stolen from him by a forged piece of paper and a felled tree. He rode back to the ranch house, a broken man. He didn't go to the study. He walked straight into the stifling heat of the kitchen. Martha was standing at the massive butcher block, rhythmically pounding a slab of venison. She stopped when she saw Elias's face. He sank into a wooden chair, burying his face in his soot-stained hands. "They blocked the road," Elias whispered, the fight completely gone from his voice. "Beaumont claimed a false quarantine. He's taking the inspector to his place. It's over, Martha. I've lost the ranch. I've lost my father's legacy." Martha set her meat mallet down. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet kitchen. She walked over to her husband. For the first time since their wedding day, she touched him, placing a large, warm hand on his trembling shoulder. "Elias," she said softly. He looked up. His eyes, usually so hard and unyielding, were wet with unshed tears. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He didn't see a burden. He saw the woman who had stood in the blistering sun for 12 hours yesterday, lifting 30-pound iron pots, commanding a crew of hardened cowboys with nothing but a wooden spoon and an unbreakable will. He saw the flush of life in her cheeks, the undeniable strength in her broad shoulders, and the deep, anchoring calm in her brown eyes. "I was so wrong about you," Elias choked out, the admission tearing from his throat. "I judged you. I treated you like a nuisance. I thought your size made you weak, but you're the strongest person on this God-forsaken land. I'm sorry, Martha. I am so profoundly sorry." Martha's expression softened, a lifetime of defensive walls crumbling at the raw honesty in his voice. "We don't have time for apologies right now, Mr. Montgomery," she said, though her thumb gently stroked his shoulder. "We have a train inspector to feed." "You don't understand," Elias sighed. "Price isn't coming here. He's at Beaumont's estate right now. Beaumont hired a fancy French chef from St. Louis just to impress him. He's feeding him roasted quail, truffles, and butter-soaked pastries." Martha's eyes widened. A sudden sharp laugh escaped her lips, startling Elias. "What?" Elias asked, confused. "Elias, my father didn't just sell dry goods. He provisioned the railroad surveyor camps 5 years ago," Martha said, a fierce, brilliant light igniting in her eyes. "I know Nathaniel Price. I used to pack his saddlebags. The man has chronic dyspepsia and a stomach ulcer the size of a silver dollar. Rich, buttery French food makes him violently ill. Elias stared at her, a spark of hope catching fire in his chest. If Beaumont is feeding him heavy creams and truffles, Martha continued, untying her apron and reaching for her heavy traveling cloak, Mr. Price will be in agony by noon. Hitch the chuck wagon, Elias. We're not waiting for the inspector. We're going to crash Thaddeus Beaumont's dinner party. The gates of Beaumont's sprawling, ostentatious estate were wide open, welcoming the Union Pacific carriages. On the expansive manicured lawn, a lavish outdoor dining table had been set. Nathaniel Price, a thin, pale man with severe features, sat at the head of the table. He looked thoroughly miserable. Before him sat a plate of pigeon and crapaudine, drowning in a heavy cognac cream sauce. Beaumont sat across from him, grinning like a fox in a henhouse, holding a glass of expensive claret. "Eat up, Mr. Price," Beaumont urged smoothly. "A man of your stature deserves the finest culinary comforts, not the hardtack and beans those dirt-scratching ranchers out west try to peddle. Once we finalize the contract for my herd, I assure you, my connections with Philip Danforth Armour will guarantee." "Yes, yes, Beaumont," Price interrupted, wiping a line of cold sweat from his forehead. He took a tiny, reluctant bite of the cream-soaked bird. His stomach instantly rebelled, twisting in a familiar, agonizing cramp. He suppressed a groan, pushing the plate away. "The food is very rich, but I cannot sign a contract without seeing the Montgomery herd. Protocol dictates." "Montgomery's herd is diseased, sir," Cobb interjected from the side. "Quarantined. To go near Whispering Pines would jeopardize your entire rail line." "That is a lie of monumental proportions." The voice boomed across the lawn, loud and furious. Beaumont spilled his wine. Price jumped, rumbling up the manicured carriage path, tearing deep ruts into Beaumont's pristine lawn, was the Whispering Pines chuck wagon. Elias was at the reins, his face set in stone. Beside him sat Martha. Wyatt and 5 heavily armed ranch hands rode alongside them. "Sheriff, arrest them!" Beaumont shrieked, leaping to his feet. But before the hired guns could draw their weapons, Wyatt and his boys had their Winchesters leveled, cocked and steady. The standoff froze the lawn in terrifying silence. Martha didn't wait for permission. She climbed down from the wagon, her massive frame moving with undeniable authority. In her hands, she carried a wooden tray covered with a checkered cloth. "Martha Caldwell?" Nathaniel Price gasped, clutching his cramping stomach. "It's Martha Montgomery now, Mr. Price," she said warmly, walking right past Beaumont's drawn revolvers, as if they were garden weeds. She set the tray down directly on top of Beaumont's fine china. "And you look like you're about to pass out. I told my father 5 years ago you had no business eating rich sauces with that ulcer of yours." Price let out a dry, pained chuckle. "Your father was right, and so were you. But what is the meaning of this?" "My husband's herd is not diseased," Martha stated, her voice carrying across the lawn. "Mister, Beaumont manufactured a quarantine because he knows our cattle are the fattest, healthiest longhorns in the Dakota Territory. But I didn't come to argue the law. I came to cure your stomach, Mr. Price." She whipped away the checkered cloth. The scent that hit the air was intoxicating, completely obliterating the smell of Beaumont's cognac cream. It was a thick, smoky perfume of hickory wood and pure, honest meat. On the tray sat a massive cut of beef brisket. It had been slow-smoked for 14 hours, using a technique Martha had adapted from Charles Goodnight's original trail drive designs. It bore a stark black crust, the bark made from coarse black pepper, rock salt, and wild prairie sage. Beside it sat a steaming tin mug of dark liquid. "What is this?" Price asked, leaning forward, his mouth suddenly watering despite his nausea. "Lean, grass-fed brisket, smoked slow over hickory so the fat renders out completely, leaving nothing but tender protein," Martha explained. "No butter, no cream. Just smoke, salt, and thyme. And the drink is a broth of simmered beef bones, wild mint, and dried chamomile. Drink the broth first. It will coat your stomach." Beaumont scoffed. "You're offering the chief inspector of the Union Pacific peasant food and dirty water?" Price. Have her thrown off my land." Price ignored him. His hands trembling slightly, he took the tin mug and took a slow sip. The warm, mineral-rich broth, brightened by the mint, hit his inflamed stomach like a healing balm. The sharp cramping began to subside almost immediately. He let out a long, shuddering breath. Then, he picked up a fork and pressed it into the brisket. He didn't even need a knife. The meat parted under the gentle pressure, exposing a beautiful, rosy smoke ring. Price took a bite. He closed his eyes. The perfectly rendered beef melted on his tongue. The coarse pepper provided a sharp, clean heat that didn't linger or burn, while the savory depth of the smoke anchored the flavor. It was hearty. It was real. It was exactly what his body had been begging for. Price ate another bite, and then another. He ate with a ravenous, silent focus until half the brisket was gone. Beaumont stood in stunned, horrified silence. Elias watched his wife, his chest swelling with a love and pride so fierce it nearly knocked him over. Finally, Price wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. He stood up, his color returning, his posture straighter. He looked at Harrison Cobb. "Deputy, unless you have a signed affidavit from a certified veterinarian confirming Texas fever, you will clear that barricade immediately. If you do not, I will have the Union Pacific Legal Department strip this county of its charter." Cobb paled and took a step back. Price turned to Beaumont. "Thaddeus, your hospitality is stifling, and your food is poison. Good day." Price walked over to Elias and Martha. "Mr. Montgomery, if your cattle are half as robust and well-tended as this meal, you have yourself a railroad contract. I'll ride back with you in the wagon." The ride back to Whispering Pines was triumphant. When they arrived, Price inspected the holding pens. The longhorns were magnificent, thick, calm, and heavy. Price signed the exclusive contract on the hood of the chuck wagon, handing Elias the advance bank draft that would pay off Harrison Cobb in full, with enough left over to buy another 500 head. That evening, as the sun dipped below the Dakota horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and gold, Elias found Martha on the back porch. The ranch was safe. The men were singing around a distant campfire. Elias stepped up behind her. He didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arms around her wide waist, pulling her solid, warm back flush against his chest. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of wood smoke, vanilla, and the sweet, lingering prairie wind. Martha leaned back into him, resting her hands over his. "You saved us," Elias murmured against her skin. "You saved me." "I told you I'd feed your men, Elias," she smiled, turning her head to look at him. "I just didn't tell you I'd feed the railroad, too." Elias turned her around, taking her face in his calloused hands. "I promise you, Martha, for the rest of my days I will never underestimate the fire in your soul or the power in your hands." He kissed her, deep and lingering, sealing a vow that had finally been forged not in dust and debt, but in profound respect, fierce love, and the unforgettable taste of salvation. They were the king and queen of Whispering Pines, and their reign would be legendary. Did Martha's brilliant frontier cooking and epic revenge on the corrupt cattle baron leave you hungry for more? The Wild West was built by strong women who refused to back down, and Martha proved that true power comes in all shapes and sizes. If you love this story of romance, cast-iron justice, and a husband realizing his wife's true worth, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow story lovers, and subscribe for more incredible historical dramas.